Okay, before I ask the last question, I apologize to all of you who submitted good questions that I didn't get to ask. To those of you who submitted crazy questions, I'm not apologizing. You need to go home and do your homework. But really, we had far more questions institutionally from people here and from people around the world that I had any hope of getting to. And I do hope you'll forgive us for that. Although Lynn did cover a great deal of what people were asking in the body of his opening remarks and also in his answers to other questions. This last question, though, I think it's an interesting one. I'd like the answer to it myself. Mr. LaRouche, you've well established your authority on questions of both economic forecasting and planning. Now, especially in these times, it doesn't really take a genius to figure out that the repeal of Glass-Steagall was a mistake and that we ought to look back at FDR for some hot pointers on how to build our way out of a depression. However, anybody who digs deeper into your writings will soon discover that your economic theories are built on a foundation of an in-depth understanding of not only history, which is not so uncommon in our field, but also on theoretical physics, on mathematics, on music, and on other areas of science. Add to that a sense of humor that clearly grows raunchier as the crisis deepens. And well, all in all, it sets the bar pretty high for the rest of us. In fact, it has left some of us feeling rather inadequate. For some others who have too much of a self-love issue going on to feel inadequate, well, it just seems to piss them off. Anyway, our question really is, how do you manage it all? What's your secret? And what the hell do you eat for breakfast?
I think the secrets are expressed largely in what I write. When I always feel the more I write, the more I have to write, because I realize in writing something, I've left so many things out that I've got a bigger agenda after completing a work than I had before starting it, because the work itself just carries us. It's questions. And also, the best thing you can do, which I've insisted upon, is don't get stuck in your own generation. You have to look at the coming generations. You have to look at the past, of course, to understand the present. But you have to look at your own generation as just that, and you have to look at the other generations which are coming up. As I look at this, and I have, especially in the recent 10 years or so, actually more than that now, but since the end of the Clinton administration, one looked more and more at this question about young people coming up, because I was faced with the problem of the baby boomer generation and its influence. Now, the baby boomer generation has two aspects. One is it's a generation, and that's not necessarily good or bad. But it was dominated, especially since a certain group, go back to the end of the war, World War II. I came back from military service abroad in the spring of 1946, and the disaster had already happened. And I had made a statement which I thought would be later was somewhat prophetic, that a number of soldiers came to me in India in 1945 on April 13th, and I said, wanted to talk to me later that evening. We could do that aside. I said, yes. So they asked me a question which did not, in its nature, surprise me at the time. What is going to happen to us now that President Roosevelt has died? And I thought, and the answer came to me, it's a very simple one. We have lived under a great president. We are now faced with a very little man as president. And I'm afraid for us on that account. I was right. And then we went into a period which was evil. In Europe, it took the form of the influence of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which is a Nazi-type organization, which I ran into, and hates me, and I hated them, and the existentialist movement in the United States and abroad. We also went into a security situation under which we created a category of people of my generation coming back from war who had gotten jobs either through completing university education or going some way into the security area, what became the national security area, and which was pretty much a brainwashing area. And so you had people who were eager to keep their jobs, lest the FBI get some bad information about them. And they raised their children accordingly and tended to flee into communities where people of their own type circulated. They met with only people of their own national security cleared types in these communities. They'd raise children. That's the baby boomer generation. They raised children, and they told these children not to have any definite ideas, to be very careful about who they associated with, and so forth. And then came 1957, a recession. And the arrogance of this generation, which had raised these children, or was raising them, the arrogance went under. They became frightened. Frightened not by the security clearance question, fear of losing their position, their economic position. By 58, it was well defended. I was then an executive in a consulting firm. And people were wandering the streets and coming up to my office begging for jobs at 1/4 of the pay which they'd received from where they'd come from. And so the children of this we're better than shit layer, raised in these families, underwent an experience. In the meantime, there was a change in culture, especially in Europe and in the United States, away from classical culture. Now, if you know that classical culture is the spark of creativity, including scientific creativity, as typified by the case of Albert Einstein's violin. It's classical culture, which is the power of the imagination as applied to the questions of physical science, which is the source of the inspiration of creativity in physical science. It took that away. So then these people went on to universities. They tended to get into the so-called best universities, the Ivy League universities, and similar types, comparable types. And they were the kings of the universe. Oh, we are the perfect people. But they still had an existential fear that they would lose jobs, lose their security, as a family had, or had been in danger of losing. They went to the best universities. But they felt like an elite, because when the Vietnam War came on, they were able to manage not to get into military service by being in universities, therefore exempt from the draft, until the exemptions got pared down as we approached 1968. And they were conditioned culturally to an existentialist world outlook. And even if they studied sciences, they weren't any damn good at it because they had an existentialist attitude, which is not good for your creativity. And then came 1968. And then came the change in 1968 after May 1st, with the first step of the collapse of the U.S. monetary system. And they went ape, really ape. Now, this generation of baby boomers became a nightmare. They became promoted. They took their clothes off. They took everything off. They did all kinds of things. They took all the drugs there were to take. And they got the best positions of influence in society, especially during the Carter administration period and thereafter. And so as the older generation, my generation, began to go into the retirement age, these young whippersnappers, so-called, took over and brought their degeneration and their anti-science attitudes with them. And then with 1987, we had a deep recession, one of the deepest in our history as a recession. Panic. We went into absolute insanity in terms of our economic policy. And this generation, the baby boomer generation, is now in the top position. These were the years of George H.W. Bush, and Bill Clinton. The worst years in terms of the turn down. 1970, spring 1970, the illusion was over. Or not better than 1990, the illusion was over. 2000, 2001, the end. Then the Bushes. So we've gone through, at that point, in the end of the 1990s, I was very much concerned about what about a new generation? Because what had happened is the baby boomer generation, that is, those who were born in that period after 1945, 46, were not all of it one type, but you had the worst of them were in the top positions. And the effect on a population is if the very worst representatives of a generation is dominant, it has an effect on the attitudes in life of others. And when people get older, when they get past their 40s and 50s, they tend to become frightened if conditions are not favorable. And if they find the top generation, which is apparently successful in controlling society, leading society, is dominant, they will tend to adapt and try to imitate those who they think are more successful. So you had an ideology of a very small part of the population, like the Mark Rudds and similar trash, had risen into top positions of social influence in society, their generation. But the acceptance of the green tendency, the anti-nuclear tendency, the anti-industrial tendency, had become a dominant tendency within this population as a whole, through this structure. And therefore, being a person as I am, I said, well, where's the next, get me the next generation. That happened about 90, just about 79 going into 80 in that generation. So that's 2000, about 90, 2001. That period. So I suddenly looked into, as my presidential campaign that year, looked into some of the campuses and began to make contact with people on campuses who were truly of a new generation. They had problems that their present president had not had, different circumstances and new problems. But they were a generation which is capable of providing a succession to this trashy aspect of the ruling generation. And I was more and more committed to that, saying we have to save the population as a whole, we have to save civilization as a whole. But what are you going to do it with? You have to reach out to a generation which is not so deeply demoralized as the baby boomer age generation had become demoralized. And only through their action are you going to get the kick in the rear end, which brings even some of the older guys of the baby boomer generation back into reality. And that's exactly what's happened. But I lived my whole life with this kind of view. I live in history. I go back to about 6,000 years in terms of my fascination in history. And so I look at mankind in that way. I look at mankind as a history of mankind, the development of mankind, the issues of mankind, the problems of mankind. And look at it always from a standpoint of creativity, that mankind is characterized by creativity which no animal has. And it's the role of creativity, human individual creativity, as expressed in classical artistic composition, and as spills over from classical artistic composition into physical science, as we know physical science from the time of the Pythagoreans and Plato and so forth, which is all one mass to me. And that's what I live in. I live in a devotion to what I think are the treasures of mankind, or the categorical treasures of mankind, and the defense and promotion of what I consider the treasures of mankind. I like to look across at other cultures and find it in other cultures. I particularly like to find it in our own culture, our own European culture, and discover more deeply the secrets of our own culture, of its achievement, and bring them forth. And that's what I write about. That's who I am. I am not the careerist. I have no career. I'm just a person who I am, who is tumbling through experience of life and expressing things that I think are important, as today.